Welcome to Psychology 6900 Research Methods, and today I'm going to talk about operational definitions. So let's talk about a few other concepts. An independent variable, that's the variable controlled by the experimenter, and the dependent variable is the one that's measured by the experimenter. Now, in an experiment, both of those variables need to be operationally defined. So in other words, the experimenter needs to translate abstract psychological constructs into either tangible measurements or situations. So when you think of it, most of the things that we deal with in psychology are abstract. They aren't something that you can see, and it's only with an operational definition that they can be made into real things. So many psychological constructs such as anxiety, frustration, intelligence can be measured with existing psychological tests. So oftentimes when you're doing an experiment, you would just look for a valid test. If one of your variables is depression, you might use the Beck Depression Scale. But there are a lot of advantages to measuring constructs in different, more creative ways. A lot of times the measurement is less obvious. You reduce demand characteristics. In other words, when you hand someone a Beck Depression inventory, they know that you're interested in how depressed they are. So if you find a different way of measuring it, a more subtle way, you eliminate that demand characteristic. Also, the measure can be more valid since instead of depending on what the person says, you're oftentimes directly looking at their behavior. So let's think of some creative ways to operationalize some psychological variables. Altruism. We want to see how altruistic people are. One thing you can do is give people a psychological scale, say rate how altruistic you are, what would you do in these situations, but people will probably exaggerate. People like to think that they're good people, they'd like to think that they'll do good things, so you might not get an accurate response to that. So one way to measure that more subtly is to place wallets in public places and see if people return them. Affiliation, people's tendency to affiliate with other people. Well, you could have people in a waiting room and you could see whether they talk to other people in the waiting room. Aggression. Oftentimes, well, there have been a number of experiments where people are in a sham learning experiment. They're told, this person in the other room, we're doing an experiment to see what will increase their rate of learning. We'd like you to press this shock button every time they get an answer wrong. So they think that the goal of the experiment is helping the other person learn, whereas really the goal of the experiment is to measure their level of aggression. Anxiety. There was, before I tell you about this next experiment, let me tell you that a lot of these measurements would no longer be considered ethical. Once the experiment is done, we've gotten the information, we don't need to do horrible experiments over again. This next experiment measuring anxiety, Middlemist study in 1976, he actually put a hidden camera in men's rooms, and how long you take to start when you're in the men's room is a measure of anxiety. He used that as a covert, rather intrusive, but a covert measure of anxiety. Depression. Better than a depression scale would be to get a mental health professional's rating of how depressed someone is. So you could interview the person and based on their body language and the sort of things they say, you could use that to rate their depression. Well, let's talk about some creative ways to operationalize independent variables. So these are the things that you're doing to the participants. Frustration. You could induce frustration by having a vending machine that either does or doesn't deliver a product when people put money in. A very frustrating event. And for all of these variables, generally what you need is to do something that people would generally agree, either based on research or based on common sense, is a good measurement or a good induction of your variable. Self-esteem. Classically, self-esteem has been varied by giving positive or negative feedback from a personality test. So you give people a personality test, and regardless of how they perform on it, you tell them, you know, the results of your personality test indicate that you're very unlikely to be successful in life. And again, let me point out, not too ethical, and if you did get permission to do a study like that from a human subjects committee, you absolutely would need to debrief your participants after the study and tell them that you just made something up. Anxiety. Put people in a waiting room for 20 minutes and tell them they're going to participate in an experiment where they get a strong electrical shock. That would be a way of inducing anxiety. So as you can see, you can be very creative when you design an experiment, and thinking of ways other than paper and pencil tests are often helpful in designing effective experiments.